Hi, everybody. Welcome to tonight's International Committee webinar. My name is Jorge Rocha. I am the co-chair of DSA, the International Committee. I'm based out of New York City, and tonight we have an excellent panel for you. Before we get into it, I'll give you a quick introduction in terms of what the International Committee is. The International Committee is the international relations arm of the Democratic Socialists of America, the largest social organization in the United States. What we do is we focus on the foreign policy for the organization, as well as consider all the complicated and interesting and sometimes even boring, but in this case, this panel will be very interesting and entertaining of the various international politics that exist in the world. But also, importantly, we are the diplomatic relations arm of the organization, representing DSA to all the different left parties and our partners around the world. And we're spreading the great gospel of DSA in terms of the wins we've done and also the growing socialist movement in the United States. Make sure that if you liked what you heard in terms of this panel, or you're interested in terms of getting more involved with the International Committee, be sure to join the International Committee by going to this link. Put in the chat, but for those who are watching at a later date, it's dsaic.org/apply is the hyperlink in terms of a short version. But also be sure to join the Mexico Working Group as let me put a link in the chat if you're interested in terms of getting involved with Mexico work specifically. Why for me personally, this issue is really important to me, as I am myself of Mexican descent. My parents are from Tamaulipas, Mexico, is on the northern border of Mexico with the United States. I grew up in Texas, but that's where my family is originally from. And in fact, it's also that general area of southern Texas and northern Mexico is where, from what I can tell, my family's been around for at least 200 years. So it's despite what people might say, Texas is still very much a historically tied with Mexico, and I would even argue is still very much that to this day. But that's not what we're going to litigate today. What we will discuss today is in terms of the incredible work that's happening in Mexico now. Last time we did a webinar was last year on Mexico, and we had with Mexican journalist Jose Luis Granados Ceja, who writes for Venezuela Analysis. Make sure to check out his work and also check out the webinar. And in mentioning Jose Luis, we also partnered with the Mexico Solidarity Project to help bring Jose Luis to several chapters around the United States to talk about the elections that are happening this year in Mexico. So thank you to the Mexico Solidarity Project for partnering with us to make sure that tour that tour with Jose Luis happened across the U.S. Now I'm going to pass it over to Luisa, who can give you a better explanation in terms of what the format and what this panel will be about.
Hey, thank you, Jorge. So my name is Luisa. She, her pronouns. I'm on the National Committee, Political Committee of DSA, and I am thrilled to be a part of another Mexico action. Obviously, there's lots of stuff going on, not just the fact that presidential elections are coming up, but also, obviously what's happened in Ecuador. The IC, I think we stated on Twitter wholeheartedly, along with many other organizations and countries, condemning what happened and condemning the Ecuadorian government's armed invasion of the Mexican embassy in Quito. We're going to talk about that, but that's also obviously at the forefront of everybody's minds. But in terms of the agenda, we'll have Alina speak first, and then we'll have Kurt. And then I will ask a couple questions while folks think of wonderful questions to ask our guest speakers. And we'll have lots of time for audience Q&A. I think it's more interesting when we have more of a discussion. And so please get your questions ready. And then also just out of respect for our guests, if we could avoid maybe having a whole different conversations going on at the same time while our guest speakers are talking, I think that would be respectful of them. So with that, let me see, I think that was, yeah, I'll speak. Alina, are you, before I introduce you, are you ready to speak first?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Oh, perfect. Okay, well then I will go ahead and introduce Alina. Alina Duarte is an independent Mexican journalist, socialist feminist, and contributor to the Raíz Media. She is also with el Instituto Nacional de Formación Política de MORENA, or the National Institute for Political Education. She is also a graduate of la Escuela de Formación Política de Buen Vivir through el Ministerio de Movilidad Humana y Relaciones Exteriores de Ecuador, or the Ministry of Human Mobility and Foreign Relations in Ecuador. She has dedicated herself to journalism since 2012, collaborating in various media outlets in Mexico, Venezuela, Honduras, Argentina, and the United States. So, Alina, please.
Well, Lisa, thanks for the invitation. As you can see, I'm in the middle of the street. I'm about to participate in a meeting. So sorry for that. I would like to first apologize for my bad English, but I'm gonna try to do my best. And I would like to start first condemning what happened at the Mexican embassy. As you said, Luisa, very important to say this in every single place that we are participating at, because definitely this could only have happened with the support of the U.S. government. So it's very important asking you as a U.S. citizens, as activists, as member of the DSA, to condemn with us what happened last Friday with the embassy of Mexico in Ecuador. So what we're going to see now, starting with the election part, what we're going to see the June the 2nd here in Mexico is something that is going to be historic. First, this is the first time in 100 years that the left is now in government after the revolution in 1910. So secondly, it's a victory of the feminist movement that have been fighting for this to happen. I mean, two women and two candidates, definitely there are several interests behind each. So a woman in one side who comes from the student movement, from founding Morena, the national regeneration movement, and on the other hand, a woman who first he called herself indigenous, and this is the less important thing of the discussion, but I would like to say that they are trying to make these elections something about identity politics, and definitely this is something that we need to see from the class analysis. What we are seeing, especially during the last month, are two women that are representing different interests. Definitely, we could start.
Oh, looks like we lost Alina. Oh no, yeah. That's very appropriate use of chat. Frowny faces. So try to give it a minute. Maybe Kurt, would you feel comfortable going? And we can just
Yeah, I can maybe fill in a little bit until Lena comes back and then hand it back off. That would be fine. So hi everyone. My name is Kurt Hackbarth, and I write for Jacobin magazine in the US and Sentido Común magazine in Mexico. I'm a columnist and been covering Mexico and the Fourth Transformation extensively over the past 5 years. And it's been great to have that space in Jacobin to do that, because Anyone who reads the US and Anglophone press knows how terrible the coverage of Mexico and Latin America in general usually is. So it's great to have a consistent space to be able to cover and analyze Mexico on a consistent basis. And I also have a new podcast with Jose Luis Granado Ceja, who was the previous guest in this webinar, called Soberanía, which is the Spanish word for sovereignty, the Mexican politics podcast, and that's on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcast. And so we invite everyone to subscribe and join us over there. So Luisa asked me to talk about the issue of how corruption is discussed as a campaign issue. And I think that was a good way to start kind of visualizing how this campaign is going. And it's probably a good way of understanding why Morena is in such a strong position, right? On the left, we're so used to being on the defensive pretty much everywhere currently in the world that it's almost hard to believe that Morena is winning an election after having already governed a term and been through, you know, the pandemic and all of the blows that the world threw at Mexico and other countries over these past 6 years, to be in pole position and be leading by, you know, between 25 to 30 points in the polls. Really a very strong position to be in. And a key to that is this corruption issue, right? Corruption has been kind of an issue that has been appropriated by the right in many countries recently, that we're the anti-corruption, we're the cleanup parties. And one of the great strengths of López Obrador has been to bring the corruption issue back over to the left, right? Prior to Morena's taking power in 2018, there had been, you know, a 30-year neoliberal night in Mexico, where corruption reigned supreme. And it's hard to overstate that point. We don't have enough time to go into it now. But Mexico had devolved into a kleptocratic state where both of the right-wing parties, the PRI and the PAN, were totally on the take, you know, using federal, state, and local budgets, you know, for their purposes, buying votes, funneling money into campaigns, funneling money into their different companies and such. So AMLO really ran as the anti-corruption candidate in 2018, right? And was spectacularly successful at that. You know, AMLO, if nothing else, has very clear message discipline and is very clear at driving a message home, right? So he was very successful in associating the PRI and the PAN with this 30-year, and not only that, but prior to that, kleptocratic condition, in addition to the fact that that was a time of the wholesale privatization of the Mexican state, right? You know, through the late 80s and 90s, pretty much the entire Mexican state was privatized. Telecommunications, airlines, transportation, the train network, you know, airports. Mexico's state was on the chopping block. I think over 1,000 state agencies eventually were privatized. It didn't go quite as far as Chile, but it was pretty close. It was pretty close. The mines, you know, they keep coming up. So that created a whole cast of privatization millionaires and billionaires that had profited privately off of the privatization of the Mexican state, like Carlos Slim, who got Mexican telephone company and became one of the richest people in the world, Germán Larrea of the mines, all the banks were privatized, right? So, you know, save one. So it was an important argument that AMLO said, not only that the Mexican state is corrupt, but that privatization is corruption. Privatization is corruption. He was very successful in that argument. So one of the big acts of AMLO over this sexenio, as it's called, a 6-year term, has really to take that anti-corruption fight on. For example, in terms of Huachicol, which was the theft of gasoline in the duct network crisscrossing the country, that was costing the Mexican state billions, cracking down on the growing private prison and hospital system that was being built in Mexico along the lines of the US. The mafia of pharmaceutical distributors who control with an iron fist the distribution of medications in this country. Making sure that wealthy individuals and corporations paid back taxes, right? And he's in a big fight with this right now, with the head of Mexico's second largest television company, TV Azteca, also a former public television station that was privatized, TV Azteca. Ricardo Salinas Pliego owes $3.5 billion in back taxes and is refusing to pay. And that's happening right now, that AMLO is at loggerheads with Salinas Pliego. With abusive contracts across the board. So part of AMLO's popularity, 70, between 65 and 80%, depending on different measurements, has to do with that constant anti-corruption fight, together with a raft of social programs, the nationalization of lithium, things that we can talk about later. So how is that playing out in this election? Well, it's very clear, right? Because the conservative coalition candidate, Xochitl Gálvez, is totally tarred with corruption. The powers that be in the conservative camp thought that they could, choose Xochitl as a candidate. About a little bit what Alina was talking about, kind of trying to play the identity politics card, but they didn't do their Oppo research. They didn't really do a very good job checking out her resume beforehand and her past, right? So a whole series of corruption scandals have come out about Xochitl Gálvez, which only reinforces this idea of the historical corruption of the PRI and the PAN. There's a whole list. She bought an apartment in Mexico City with a huge discount from a contractor who she had favored when she was the bureau chief of the Miguel Hidalgo Bureau of Mexico City. The apartment didn't have its proper permits, didn't have an authorization of use and occupation. She was the head of the Miguel Hidalgo Bureau in Mexico City between 2015 and 2018. Where her companies, High-Tech Services and OME, did very well with contracts. This is exactly the old style of Mexican politics, right? The old style of using your position to shovel contracts into your companies, right? And she's got a whole network of companies, right? Companies in her name, companies in her husband's name. It just came out in the debate on Sunday that she was getting all kinds of contracts from the INAI, which is the National Transparency Institute. What an irony. And when she was confronted with this by the MORENA candidate, Claudia Sheinbaum, she said, oh, no, it's not my company, it's my husband's, right? So they play these shell games of this company's in my name, this company's in my husband's name. It turns out, we just found out last week that Xochitl Gálvez's daughter has 2 birth certificates. 2 different birth certificates with 2 different names to be used so that she can have different positions in different one of these companies in the in this whole network of companies that Xochitl Gálvez has set up, right? So she's part of the whole network of what's called the cartel inmobiliario, the real estate cartel in Mexico City, which is members of the PAN, those who governed the more conservative boroughs of Mexico City, using their position to enrich themselves by authorizing construction projects without the proper permits. So this is dogging not only Xochitl Gálvez, which is why she has the nickname Mochitl Gálvez, from the Spanish word for moche, which is a bribe, but also the conservative candidate for mayor of Mexico City, Santiago Taboada, who has now been dubbed Santiago Tajada. And a Tajada is a cut. So the corruption issue is massive this time around. It also came out that Xochitl Gálvez plagiarized her thesis, and she said, oh, me pendeje, right? Kind of, oh, I effed up, right? She was caught out on that. She had promised that she was going to serve out her whole term as bureau head, but she didn't, because she went to the Senate and she said, if I leave, I will donate an apartment to the Colegio Salesiano, a school, right? She never did that either. And Claudia Sheinbaum called her out on that in the debate on Sunday night. anyway, so there's a lot to talk about there. But this is just by way of saying that corruption is a massive issue in the campaign. It was in 2018, and it is again this time, because the conservative coalition seemed unable to find a candidate that wasn't totally tarnished by corruption. And the people in her campaign team, right? I mean, you know, the head of the PRI, Alito Moreno, corruption. The head of the PAN, Marco Cortes, corruption. You know, you can just go down the list of people in her campaign. So, you know, the right is not going to return to power in Mexico, I hope ever. But while they keep these old names around that are just, you know, immersed in corruption. The former 2018 presidential candidate, Ricardo Anaya, is in fact, he's living in Atlanta right now. He's living in Atlanta because if he comes back to Mexico, he'll, you know, he's going to be arrested for skipping off on justice. So he's on the list of Senate candidates for the conservative coalition because when you're in the Senate, you have diplomatic immunity. So that's the only way Ricardo Anaya can come back to the country, right? Francisco Cabeza de Vaca, he's the former governor of Tamaulipas, right, where Jorge's family is from. Also on the lam for corruption in the United States, right? Also part of Xochitl's campaign team. So anyway, very brazen, this idea that the conservative thinks they can get back into power while having a list of, you know, basically a wanted list of people in their campaign team, and also on some of their candidates for Congress. One of the other topics that Luis asked me to talk about, and I think this is something that Alina is going to touch on as well, is the interaction of U.S. elections and what happened in Ecuador. So I'll talk about that very, very briefly, and then I'll give Alina the floor. Of course, they're very well connected. You know, Alina just said at the beginning of her talk that this would not have happened on last Friday if Ecuador knew that you know, the United States had their back, right? And this is what López Obrador said very clearly yesterday, right, in his morning press conference. Right? He said Ecuador would not have done this if they felt that they didn't have the support of other governments or powers. Right. And it's very interesting that just a few hours after that, the White House came out and made a stronger statement on Ecuador than they had made on Saturday, which they'd come out with a very tepid statement on Saturday saying that the United States opposes any violation of the Vienna Convention without mentioning this in particular, and asked for Mexico and Ecuador to work out their differences in a very paternalistic way, basically putting on the same level an aggressor and the victim of an aggression. Right, which is basically like telling an abused person, "Oh, just work it out with your, you know, work it out with the abuser." Right? Canada, basically the same. Right. So it was funny that you know, López Obrador steps it up and says basically the U.S. you know was behind this, and the White House comes out. So now it's interesting that the White House and the State Department are saying different things on this. The White House, however, did not mention Jorge Glass, the former vice president, victim of lawfare. Who was taken to the hospital and is now on a hunger strike after either to try to take a medical overdose or trying to commit suicide. Mexico said he continues to be under our asylum, right? So what happened on Friday was a kidnapping. It was a kidnapping when they went into the embassy there. And we were talking with Jorge before the program started. You know, it's no secret that this happened just a few days after the bombing of the Iranian consulate in Damascus, right, which the U.S. washed its hands of. So the message is very clear. If you're a U.S. toady, you can do what you want. You can bomb an embassy, you can invade an embassy, you can grab, you can kidnap, right? And that, you know, with impunity. And this is part of a larger strategy of the United States in Latin America to try to forestall any attempt at regional coordination, right? So they've got Javier Milei in Argentina, you know, throwing his verbal bombs and getting Colombia to withdraw their ambassador. And now you've got Noboa, you know, the Banana King in Ecuador, you know, welcoming Southcom's Laura Richardson, right? Ecuador recently signed 2 new agreements allowing U.S. troops to operate on Ecuadorian soil and the U.S. Navy to operate in Ecuadorian waters. Richardson said she wants to start a new drug war in Ecuador, knowing how well those work, right? So, you know, kind of like the Plan Merida in Mexico, the Plan Colombia, right? And using Ecuador as a staging area, right? To continue to, you know, advance U.S. interest in the region. One of those interests is that Latin America not unified. So it's very good to hear that the CELAC was convened this week, the Organization of Latin American and Caribbean Nations, also to make a pronouncement on what happened and not leave, you know, not leave the kind of leave the initiative to the Organization of American States. And it also should be noted that Laura Richards said fentanyl is about to flood Latin America or South America, right? Which is, you know, the pretext they need and want to operate more aggressively in the region, especially with regards to energy resources in the lithium triangle, right? Between Argentina, Chile, Bolivia, where I think 70% of the world's lithium is located. Anyway, there's a lot more to say. I want to give Alina the floor, and then we can talk more later.
Alina? Okay, see you.
Yes, I'm sorry for the connection. Well, after what Kurt was saying, I'd like to say there is no doubt about the comparison to the presidency are. Well, two of them, because there is a third one, but it's not really important to talk about. In addition to what Kurt said, I will say that Xochitl Gálvez is a woman voted by the Mexican oligarchy. Months ago, it was just unthinkable that someone like her could become the candidate of the opposition parties, even in Mexico City, where she was a mayor, no one even knows her. However, it was an agreement of the oligarchies, of the elites in Mexico, and even in the US, I must say that promoted his candidacy in just a few weeks, of course, with the help of the media, the corporate media. The same media actually that declared a war against the so-called four transformations for so many years. On the other hand, Claudia Sheinbaum represents a social left that decided to opt for the electoral route since its creation. Claudia Sheinbaum is a scientist. She was professor for so many years at the university. Also, she was part of the student movement in the UNAM, in the largest university here in Mexico. She was one of the founders of MORENA with AMLO, with the president. She governed one of the mayor here in Mexico City and later Mexico City. What is at stake are two national projects. On the one hand, that of the oligarchies that dismantled the Mexican state for so many years. These projects have the full support of the United States and its spokesperson, not only the Department of State or the OAS, but the New York Times, actually the Washington Post, the CIA, the DEA, and recently we see what happened in Ecuador. I would like to say that it's probably very probable that the next president of Mexico is going to be Claudia Sheinbaum, because the popularity of President López Obrador is undeniable at this moment. He has more than 70% of support of the population. More than 30 million Mexicans receive a social program, and even when the corporate media is says otherwise, violence in Mexico is finally going down. This project of the so-called for transformation is actually very similar to what has been experienced in Latin America during the last 25 years, the so-called progressive government that represents the reduction of violence, poverty, inequality, projects that change definitely the lives of millions of people. Why is it important to have this kind of conversation? Because as Kurt said, recently the intervention of the US has been extremely cynical. You know, the DEA allegedly leaked documents to media such as Inside Crime, New York Times, the Washington Post, ProPublica, assuming a possible relationship between AMLO and the drug trafficking, which unleashed a media and social network campaign during the last for several weeks, and in which they have invested millions of dollars so far. Definitely, the solidarity that you can show by doing these conversations on social networks and in any way will not only be welcome, but it's, I think, necessary against the interventionism of the US. So, Luisa, Court, I think it's important to listen to you all, and if my connection allows me, I'm gonna try to answer some questions.
Perfect. Okay, so I actually have some questions in chat. Is now a great time to prepare what you'd like to ask for either of our guest speakers. But I was wondering, and this question is to either of you, but I imagine Alina, that if you could talk a little bit about the distinction between the feminism that's represented by NGOs in Mexico, right? Really what NGOs, the social role that NGOs have played in Mexico prior to the Ford transformation, and then what a working class vision of feminism looks like in Mexico.
Well, I don't know if Corey wants to say something. I would say that the feminism struggle has historically been captured by capital, by organizations, and in Mexico it has description. So what we're seeing inside Morena, because I must say that in Mexico, also, even when they're voting for Morena, they are supporting Amnio's administration. Population, it's a little bit, to be honest, or I don't know how to say it, even like it's pretty conservative in several issues, especially on feminist issues, or even, especially on that. So it has been a fight inside Morena, inside the Ford transformation, just to push these kind of demands from another vision of feminism. I wouldn't say, for example, I know that there is a feminist part here in Mexico, so a feminist movement against the Ford transformation on the streets, on the media, a liberal one. So the fight inside Morena is just to build this kind of movement with a class perspective. You know, we are, I define myself a socialist, and I'm part of the Institute of Political Formation, and I must say that there are several socialists inside Morena. We are not a big majority, but this is a kind of Morena. It's not only a left progressive party, it's like an open wide front in its foundation. So you can find leftist people, socialist ones, but also conservative people, even members of the oligarchy as an allies. You know, it's pretty complicated just to define one kind of party in Morena. So I think it's a fight, like every single party. It's a constant fight to build a feminist, socialist movement, or just a movement inside Morena that goes to the roots of the left, that deal with the working class, with the working women. So we are trying to build this feminist movement inside the party, inside the government, and there have been a lot of achievements. For example, in terms of fight on equality, gender inequality, in fighting violence against women. There are several proposals of Claudia Sheinbaum in its campaign. So I think it's still a challenge for all the women inside the party, inside the movement, inside the government, but we are ready to fight definitely.
Yeah, I would just add very briefly to that. I agree with Alina that there's there's a good way to, there's still a long way to go on that, but there's also been some significant victories. Morena legislatures have legalized abortion in 9 states. Abortion has been legalized by the Supreme Court here, but the states have to implement state laws to implement that ruling, and that's only happened in Morena governed states. I think Morena has made the case that a lot of their most important initiatives, class policies is women's policy, right? Morena has raised the minimum wage, has doubled the minimum wage over the AMLO's term. A large number of the minimum wage workers are women. Scholarships, stay-in-school scholarships for students, but help working mothers. The universal pension system that came in, help, particularly in Mexican families where women disproportionately have to take care of older family members, right? Disproportionately, right? Very much in Mexican families. So that's another measure that has very much been beneficial to women. And the Coneval Institute of National Statistics came out with a report that MORENA social programs in general have lifted 5 million people out of poverty over the course of this term, and 9 million from the peak of the pandemic. And, again, that's a disproportionate number are women who usually work in minimum wage service industries, the lowest paying jobs, or have, conditions and families there, right? That said, there is a lot more to go in social issues. I think, Alina was quite correct that Morena is a broad front. Not everyone in the party is progressive on social issues, so that's been a fight that's going to have to continue. And I think Claudia Sheinbaum is very clear on that. In her 100-point plan, there's a lot specifically that has to go in women's issues, right? So one thing that Claudia Sheinbaum wants to do is take that 65 and over national pension and bring it down to 60 for women, knowing that a lot of women work in jobs or work at home where they haven't been able to build up any kind of retirement fund, any kind of retirement account, because retirement funds were privatized in the 90s in Mexico. So if you don't have an IRA, you've got nothing until this national pension system came in with AMLO. So that's one thing. She wants to build on what she's done with women's policy in Mexico City with regards to a women's hotline, the gender alert, with regards to having women in all public prosecutors' office dealing with women's issues. So those would be also steps forward.
Okay, and then this question is for Kurt, and then I have a different question for Alina. So Kurt, we mentioned the fourth transformation a couple of times, and so if you could maybe briefly explain what that is, what we're referencing, and then also, well, actually, let's just get to that first, if you don't mind.
Okay, so López Obrador is a keen student of history, and he very astutely situated this movement, which is, this is a movement that dates back before the 2018 election. This was AMLO's third presidential election. His first election in 2006 was a fraudulent election. They stole it from him by 0.5 percentage point. The 2012 election was a bought election, literally bought with debit cards for voters. So this is a movement that goes back to the democratization of the country in the 1990s with the PRD. And what AMLO calls all of this is the fourth transformation, and it's called in abbreviated terms the 4T, or the 4T. The other previous transformations that he refers to would be the first transformation was the independence, the War of Independence from Spain between 1810 and 1821, when Mexico became an independent country. The reform era of the 1850s with Benito Juarez, when Mexico fought a civil war between the liberals and the conservatives. Quite a generation, the Benito Juarez generation, because they fought a civil war against the conservatives and won. And then the conservatives called in a Habsburg emperor, and France, Spain, and England invaded Mexico and installed the Habsburg emperor on the throne, and they beat them and shot the Habsburg emperor on the firing squad, Maximilian. So that was the reform era, which separated the secular state from the church, created the secular laws, right? It created the modern Mexican state, or the foundations of the modern Mexican state. The third transformation would be the very famous Mexican Revolution, beginning in 1910, right? With the well-known figures that we know, Emiliano Zapata, Pancho Villa, Tierra Libertad, which set the basis for the 20th century Mexican state, with some elements of a welfare state, but which installed the hegemony of the PRI. So it's it's ruled for 70 years here. So it's so interesting now to see the PRI so weak, so puny, so minuscule, so nothing. There's a real historical satisfaction in that.
Excellent, thank you. So for Alina, two questions. One is more procedural, which is how can Mexicans in the United States vote? And secondly, how can people in the United States support leftist movement in Mexico? What can we do?
Well, for the first questions, Mexicans in the US have to register, but the registration has already closed 2 or 3 weeks ago. I don't remember the date, so they could vote. So now, if they registered themselves months ago, now they can go to the embassy, and it's an electronic vote. So it was pretty easy, but now I don't remember how many people can vote from outside Mexico. I think it's last elections voted around 1 million of Mexicans, even when we are more than 50 million of Mexicans living outside, and specifically around 45 million of Mexicans in the US. What can you do for the next, specifically for the next week? Definitely, we need you to be very aware of the upcoming elections. The right wing party, the opposition, has already announced that they will try to annul, to cancel the elections with thousands of pretexts. We need you to help us inform the American people, the US citizens. We need your help, and also I think be informed that it's very revolutionary nowadays. So we need you to not only to be informed, but also to inform another people in the US. It doesn't matter where they come from. What happened, for example, last Friday, as I was saying, wouldn't have been possible without the support of the US. And now they're trying, for example, to establish the idea that Ecuador violated international laws because there was a criminal inside the embassy. That is total and absolute lie. So we need you to be informed. We need to say to raise your voice. We need to also to help us deny what the New York Times, the Washington Post, and all of these corporate media are publishing every single day. We need you to express your solidarity against the every single thing that not only Mexico, the US is doing against Mexico, but also in the whole region, in Latin America. There are also upcoming elections in Venezuela in July, if I'm not wrong. I know that also Republicans and Democrats, both of them are just trying to say every single day something against Mexico. It doesn't matter if they're senators, congressmen, congresswomen. They're attacking us every single day. And we are very scared about what's going to happen. I don't know, maybe we can make another webinar to listen to you about what's going to happen in the US elections, because we saw in Latin America that there is no difference between Democrats and Republicans in foreign policy. We've seen every single term invasions, coups, so with Donald Trump, we saw this attack against the Mexican government with AMLO in 2017, 18. But also we saw the attacks against Venezuela, against the whole region, and now I don't think it's going to be the exception. So we need you to raise your voice, to keep informed, to show up your solidarity, even in the Ecuadorian embassy, in the US, or in social networks. Also to listen to new podcasts as the one who is now Soberanía with Court and Jose Luis. Please help us to inform another people, another comrades, because there is so much disinformation. So that's, I think, the most revolutionary thing that you can do in the upcoming weeks, months. I think we can make a permanent campaign of solidarity with the whole region.
Here's a question. So Kurt mentioned that Mexico is one of the places where the left is winning. So this is perpetually a question for us in the US left. What are the conditions and strategies that have led to the unique position for the left in Mexico? And are there other countries where similar conditions or strategies has gone well for the left? And basically, how do we learn from this? What can we take for our own organizing in the imperial core? I like to say the largest terrorist state in the world. What can we take for our organizing from what Morena has achieved? And maybe Kurt, you can go first, and we'll go to Alina.
Maybe Alina might want to go first because I think she has to leave a little early. So I think I want to give, maybe we should give her as much time as possible, and then I can jump in after.
Yeah, sorry, I need to leave. I need to participate in this forum here in the outside of Mexico City. So I would like to thank you, Luisa, to all your comrades. Please, I don't know what else I can do to be I don't know, to help you, to give you some information. I don't know. We are making the invitation for you to participate as observers in the elections. Luisa is helping us to coordinate this brigade, this group of solidarity for coming to the elections. Even if you cannot come, as I said, the right wing is trying to annul, to cancel the election. So it's going to be very important for us, your solidarity, especially on June the 2nd. So I want to thank you again, Luisa, Jose Luis, and of course, Duarte, and everyone in the DSA movement. So I need to run, but thank you again for considering me for participating in this space.
Thank you, Lina.
See you soon.
Okay. Nos vemos, Alina, nos vemos pronto. So I think Luisa just hit on a very, very, very important question. What is, the secret sauce there? What is the secret to Morena's success? And what is it that we can learn in the US and English-speaking countries about that? I just put a link in the chat to, I think, an excellent article by Edwin Ackerman in Sidecar called the AMLO Project. And I highly recommend that everyone take a look at that, because that's a good answer to that question. And part of what Edwin Ackerman says in that article very clearly is that Morena has passed a raft of legislation that benefits the working class, right? It hasn't done a Democrat. It hasn't, cut off the working class to focus on bourgeois donors. So you have a party over the past nearly 6 years that's passed a universal pension, disability benefit, aid to mothers with dependents, scholarships, stay-in-school scholarships for public schools, right? Xochitl Galvez is saying, oh, we want scholarships, but she wants to also be for private schools, basically to copy the voucher system, right? That came out in the debate on Sunday. A very good union law that creates a secret ballot election for unions and creates the requirement that all companies within 5 years renegotiate their union contracts and sets up a system of union tribunals. It's been slow to get going, but Mexico is in very critical condition with unions. So any step forward in that sense is a good one. The minimum wage, raising it 20% year on year. It's still too low. It's still ridiculously low, but it's 100% more than it was. And it's more in the border area. Claudia Sheinbaum says she wants to continue raising the minimum wage by 13% a year so that it can get up to what she says is 2.5 canastas básicas, or 2.5 times kind of the daily basket of food that you need, right? Morena is working towards a national healthcare system. This was interrupted during the pandemic, but they set up a system called IMSS Bienestar, which is they're basically federalizing health, which had been dumped on the states in the neoliberal era, basically to wash their hands of it, right? So now IMSS Bienestar is taking that back into federal hands. There's still a way to go, but they're working towards universal healthcare. AMLO has just come out with a 20-point plan of constitutional reforms, and one of them includes pension reform. As I said, pensions had been privatized in the 90s, so now he wants you to be able to retire at your last salary, which would be ambitious, right? Be able to retire at the last salary you were making, which would require the state to top up the IRAs system, basically. Not scrap the IRAs together, which the Workers' Party is calling for with Gerardo Noroña. He said the pension should become public again, right? Morena isn't going that far, but at least there's the top up. There's this idea of topping up pensions so you can retire on your last salary. There's a proposal in there to make indigenous and Afro-Mexican communities subjects of sujetos de derecho público, which means basically they have more legal standing to defend resources and be able to litigate for their rights in courts. This was a long-standing demand going back to the Zapatistas, right? So the long and short of it is AMLO has created a broad coalition. He's gone up against international energy interests like Iberdrola and Enel. He's tried to bring more public control over the public grid. He just bought 13 power plants from Iberdrola, right? So now Mexico is at 54% of public energy production rather than 46%. Remember when Texas went black a few years ago, that affected all of northern Mexico as well. And so that was a big stimulus. Like we're not playing the US game of privatized energy grids, right? So this is kind of all by way of saying that, and I hope this continues, I desperately hope this continues, that Morena has created and satisfied enough of its coalition to keep the center and the left happy in Morena, because it's a presidential system, and so you've got to create a party that's big enough to win a majority. And part of the other answer is the charisma of López Obrador himself, and that's just an unrepeatable quality. And he's just one of those once in a lifetime charismatic politicians. And he's just got just a way of speaking, a way of turning a phrase, a way of using very earthy and interesting vocabulary. He's got a Tabascan accent. He's not clearly from Mexico City. He grew up in a working class family that had a store. You can tell, he's got the all of that, all of that mojo. And that's something that Claudia Sheinbaum doesn't have. Claudia comes from Mexico City. She comes from a polished middle-class background. She has a doctorate. She studied in the United States. But that hasn't been to her detriment so far in the campaign. She's played the role of kind of this poker-faced, no-nonsense candidate, I'm not going to brook any shit from anyone kind of candidate, not from the moderators of the debate, which had some very loaded questions against Morena, not from Xochitl Gálvez, not from anyone else. So Xochitl Gálvez in the Sunday debate, they tried to play this line that she's cold and heartless, cold and heartless, cold and heartless. Obviously, she had her advisors saying, repeat this a lot. You're cold and heartless, you're cold and heartless, you're cold and heartless. When actually it was Xochitl Gálvez who wound up looking cold and heartless because she was just repeating these kind of desperate sounding attack lines. Claudia Sheinbaum didn't even bother to answer her most of the time. She was focused, and that's the advantage of the Sheinbaum campaign. It's a very disciplined campaign. Every day this meeting, every day this rally, every day this pronouncement, and she's got a series of policy pronouncements that are related to the themes of the three debates. They've obviously thought this out. Whereas the Xochitl Gálvez campaign seems very improvised, very shoot from the hip, a very kind of reactive to the different scandals, right? And then just things that just don't look presidential. Like she was caught taking gum out of her mouth and putting it on a chair at an event. And it's like, these are maybe small details, but things that you have to take care of, and they've got all these high-priced advisors. So, nobody told her, don't take gum out of your mouth at an event, or, things of that nature. During the debate, she tried to hold up some graphics and they were upside down, right? She tried to hold up a thing at the end with the Mexican flag. It was upside down. So a lot of gaffes and a lot of improvisation, because it's a campaign that's based entirely on marketing. Very much trying to copy the American style of campaigns, marketing. And Sheinbaum's got the advantage of a Morena fueled campaign. I wrote this in Jacobin a couple of articles ago. It's hard, in the US, which is so depolitized and politicized in a party sense. Obviously, America is very politicized with regards to social movements and unions. But, how many people could the Democrats and Republicans turn out? Morena turned out 350,000 people for the Sheinbaum campaign launch on March 1st, which is basically the size of a New Orleans or a Cleveland. The rally last year to defend, the history of the anniversary of the expropriation of petroleum and to defend the nationalization of lithium, 500,000 people turned out. So you've got one of the world's biggest cities that shuts down when Morena comes to town. And you've got people coming in, and you've got marching bands, and you've got delegations, and you've got people dancing on the streets. And I'm not exaggerating. I've got videos on my Twitter of that day when I was out in the streets with Jose Luis. And that's the energy that Morena has. Now, Morena has got some internal problems. It's got some very unpalatable candidates at the state and local level. There's a phenomenon of what's called chapulines, which is grasshoppers, which are people that hop from one party to another. And Morena has been far too willing to adopt candidates from other parties at the local level who have local followings or a local fiefdom, just so that they could win an election where they might not otherwise win one. But that demotivates people. If they see someone who's been, criticizing López Obrador and criticizing Morena is all of a sudden a Morena candidate, jumping over loyal party members. So this is something that Morena is going to have to work out, because there's been a lot of blowback at the local level of some of the candidate choices this time around.
Going back to what you said about Scheinbaum's class background and how it's distinct from AMLO's, that's something I could wax poetic just a second. That's something that I've thought about and reflected about, particularly because I grew up very poor, right? And just understanding that many of our revolutionary leaders come from middle class backgrounds. Che was a doctor, for Christ's sake, Fidel was a lawyer. So that's not, even myself as somebody who grew up poor, that's not the ultimate determiner, right, in terms of one's loyalty to social justice. It's really how, what you do, the political education that you receive that allows you to start to begin a kind of class suicide, right, where you ultimately identify not necessarily as middle class or even a race or ethnicity, but first and foremost, a dedicated socialist. So anyway, that just provoked my mind. But somebody did have a question, and I'll summarize it. But basically, how do we reconcile AMLO's and the Four Transformations building of the social welfare state with his less than admirable response to border control and the criticisms that he's more or less, doing the United States' dirty work? How do we understand that, and what are the circumstances that may have led to those political decisions?
Yeah, good question. I just wanted to say one thing on Sheinbaum, what you were just saying, Luisa, that being from the middle class is not a disqualifier, but it's something to watch out for. AMLO grew up in a small town, and he's got this myth around it. He's the man from Macuspana, Tabasco, right? His family had a small store. They had to close, the store went out of business. They had to move to Villahermosa. He lived in the Tabasco students' dormitory at the UNAM, and I think AMLO's got very good political instincts precisely because of his background, right? He doesn't get a lot of things wrong. He's got his real ear to the ground of where the public is, and really the working class. He's got good political instincts that has a lot to do with his background. Sheinbaum is just going to have to be careful that she doesn't surround herself with people like her, and it wind up being a very Mexico City kind of bougie administration. Now, there is a danger at this, because one of her big kind of flops in what was overall a very successful administration in Mexico City was she kind of put out the welcome mat to Airbnb. Right at a time of rampant gentrification, of rising rents, of people being upset at the digital nomads coming in and, shooting up rents and prices for people because she thought it would be just great to bring in and make an alliance with Airbnb with the municipal government, right? And she, people called her out on it, and she had to walk it back. So that was an example of, not so honed instincts, and she's gonna have to be careful with that. I see what somebody's saying in the chat about her parents participating in the movements. She also participated in the UNAM movement as a college student. There's been every generation of UNAM students in Mexico have to fight the public university to make sure it stays public, and she was at the forefront of that in the 80s. So she's got her bona fides. She is part of the ideological left, whereas AMLO, we could consider him a kind of nationalist populist. Sheinbaum really is part of the ideological left, and has proven it since her college days. But she's just going to have to be careful, simply because if you're from the middle class, that's how she grew up. And she's going to have to be very careful with that, because that tends to dull your political instincts. Unfortunately, it just happens. It happens, right? So the question about border control is a complicated one, and I think it's an important one. And I think the questioner is right. AMLO has not shown on this. He hasn't shown on this. I think, early on, he kind of, I think they came to the decision that migration was the area that they were going to have to concede on, basically to keep the U.S. off their backs so that they could advance in the domestic front. Do I like that? No. I think it was kind of a realpolitik kind of a calculation. At the outset of his administration, AMLO wanted to give visas to Central American workers so they could work on infrastructure projects there. The United States didn't want that, because then they said they'd use the visas to come up to the border, right? So he kind of backtracked on that. The National Migration Institute here has been terrible. I travel between Oaxaca and Mexico City regularly. Sometimes on the bus, you have to go through 3 or 4 checkpoints, and they come up on the bus, and anyone who looks, Central American is pulled off the bus, or they ask for their documents. Very, very, unpleasant and repetitive, right? There was a fire in a housing installation for migrants a couple of years ago, a year or so ago. Several of them died. It's not been good. It's not been good, right? So I think that's fair to say, right? Now, to AMLO's credit, he has set up a program where Mexico is funding social programs in Central America, including some social programs that have worked very well in Mexico, like Jóvenes Construyendo el Futuro, which is an apprenticeship program, Sembrando Vida, which is an ecological tree planting program. Mexico is doing what the U.S. is not, which is investing in social programs in Central America instead of militarization. And it's really interesting. I don't know how many people saw AMLO's interview on 60 Minutes a couple of weeks ago, where he laid out a 4-point plan for immigration, which he's been pushing now. And it is a very good plan, because it includes a lot of things that never factor into the U.S. dialogue, right? One of them is ending the embargo on Cuba. Another one is ending the sanctions on Venezuela, right? Another one is a $20 billion program for investing in social programs in Central America to attack root causes, right? AMLO's always been big on attacking root causes of violence or on migration. $20 billion is nothing for the U.S., right? It's nothing, but they still won't do it. And legalizing Mexicans who've been, in the United States for over 5 years. And it's funny that I watched the social media, on 60 Minutes afterwards. The 60 Minutes crowd is not known for being the most, a viral, aggressive crowd out there, right? But still, the reaction just to that was apocalyptic on the 60 Minutes social media. Let's invade Mexico. Let's do a coup. Let's bomb Mexico. Somebody put a nuclear bomb GIF on there. AMLO is a beggar. This is blackmail. This is extortion. So that's just, a small indicator of where the immigration debate is in the United States. So this is just to show what Mexico is up against in trying to make any headway at all in the immigration debate. Because the immigration debate is so fascist in the US, across the board, Republicans and Democrats, with small pockets. That, I'm certainly not excusing it, because I think AMLO's not been good on migration. But I just, just to put it in the context of, where the debate is in the in the U.S. with Abbott and the border and the barbed wire and whatever else. I think, again, AMLO made a real politic decision to sacrifice on the migration issue because, and this is the very cynical conclusion, migrants don't vote.
Yeah, I certainly understand. I don't agree, but I want to say that I, in some sense, me personally, as somebody who was undocumented for 16 years of my life, I understand the political situation, and those are the types of issues that the left is confronted with when it's in power. It's something that we really don't have any experience of in the United States, right? It's literally never happened. So I wanted to ask right before maybe we end, the last question is that, in your opinion, Kurt, what could be the best outcome of a Sheinbaum presidency? What could we hope to see?
I'm optimistic for a Sheinbaum presidency. I'm optimistic. She's been, the Airbnb thing aside, she was a very successful mayor, really governor of Mexico City. She brought down crime. She brought down violent crime. She instituted an excellent scholarship program. And both Sheinbaum and the candidate for mayor of Mexico City now set up these social centers, right? Sheinbaum's were called Pilares, and the other ones were called Utopias in Ixtapalapa, which is the most working class body of Mexico City. And then these wonderful social centers that have, pools and sporting facilities, but also areas where you can go and do your laundry, right? If you don't have laundry in your house, areas where you can go and eat a reduced price meal, areas where you can go and take your kids after schools, right? To take a workshop or to learn a skill or to hang out so they're not, getting involved in organized crime. This is and she wants to extend the Pilates system to other parts of the country, right? This is what I'm optimistic about. This sense of really impactful social policy, right? That can combine, the kind of traditional idea of a social center with the idea of really kind of something that goes beyond what we've seen in the States, right? That I'm optimistic about. I'm optimistic about, she's a climate change engineer. Mexico right now is going through a severe drought. So she really wants to focus on water infrastructure, which is necessary. Focusing on an energy transition, kind of a Mexican Green New Deal, but that doesn't, follow the greenwashing approach of companies, multinationals, that try to pass themselves off as, green companies in order to try to get their claws on the national grid, right? She's an expert on that. She knows that in and out. So I'm optimistic on that front as well. She wants to advance. She wants to put what's called the segundo piso, the second floor of the fourth transformation, because there's still areas, there's just areas that the second, that AMLO just didn't have time to get to. And remember, 2 of these 6 years, it was pandemic. So it was, it was all focused on vaccines and hospital beds and all that. So she wants to create what's called a republic of readers, a republic of, reading clubs and disseminating books and such in a country where a lot of people don't have access to public libraries, right? She wants to expand art and sports into schools, right? In Mexico, generally, you just go to your classes and you go home, right? So she wants students to have an opportunity to do art and sports, right? These are areas that AMLO didn't put as much of a focus on. AMLO was very much focused on, social programs, the economy, the pensions, the energy system, right? So, Sheinbaum has talked about the fact that freelance art people in the art world should have healthcare and social security, right? All of these things I'm optimistic about. And I think it's very likely that Morena is going to hold its majority in Congress, so she'll be able to, you know, push those things forward. Morena actually has a very ambitious plan. They want to get a 2/3 majority in both houses so that they can pass constitutional reforms without the conservative parties at all. And then they could take these social programs like the pensions, which are already in the constitutional level, and make them constitutional level programs so that they can't be stripped away again by any future conservative government. Will they get that? That remains to be seen, but that's what they want to do. So, you know, I think there are reasons to be optimistic here about a Sheinbaum administration. She's been very forthright on the Ecuadorian situation. You know, hasn't mentioned Palestine. But in general, you know, I think there's a lot to keep looking at Mexico for. Yeah, Claudia Brugada was I was talking about with the utopias. Yeah, that's
Utopias.
yeah. Mhm.
So last time I was in Mexico, I went like 3 or 4 times to Iztapalapa for various reasons, like to have meetings and stuff like that. Somebody joked like this, I'm like the only person who's gone to Mexico and like spent most of my time in Iztapalapa because it's in the border. It's outside the center of Mexico City, and it's where a lot of people who work in El Centro, they actually live. And it's absolutely beautiful. And Clara Brugada,
Claudia Brugada, yeah.
mayor, now she's candidate for Mexico City. Just a fun fact that I learned about her, she was actually a card-carrying Maoist for like some time in her youth and still got elected. Middle class still loves her because of all the reforms that she's been able to implement. But I just thought that was so interesting.
Yeah, it's funny that, you know, when you get out of the United States, people are not as paranoid about things like that.
Right.
You know, you realize how paranoid Americans are about things like that, right? Claudia Brugada was very involved in the housing movement because like Iztapalapa, a lot of people come to live there from the countryside, right? So she was a defender of people in housing associations, you know, really working class housing associations. For early on, you know, she went and chose to live in Iztapalapa. So Claudia Brugada is somebody else to learn a lot about. It's really interesting.
I put everybody's Twitter, including Clara's, in the chat. Kurt, thank you absolutely for joining us. We please feel free to drop anything else that you would like in the chat, and don't forget to sign up for Mexico Working Group. There'll be a meeting pretty soon, I think in like a week or two. And any last comments, Kurt, before we end it?
Yeah, I would just echo what Alina said, that Mexico solidarity is very, very important. Anything that comes from the belly of the beast and the empire is very, very important, right? You know, Alina mentioned very quickly, just starting in January, there was a series of articles. I wrote up a whole piece in Jacobin about this, from ProPublica, from Deutsche Welle, from Inside Crime, from New York Times, basically saying that AMLO's a narco. Right? His 2006 campaign was narco. His 2018 campaign was narco. This campaign's going to be narco, 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 narco. So the strategy now is to tar any progressive Latin American candidate or president as narco, right? And of course, they try to do this with Evo Morales. They try to do this with Hugo Chavez. This isn't new. But because the perception is so stereotyped in the United States that all Mexicans are, you know, drug dealers, I mean, this kind of ridiculous idea that people have. It's these ideas tend to stick. These ideas tend to stick because, oh, they're all, you know. So you know, a lot of people, there was a lot of blowback against these really poorly written articles with no proof. But then there was a whole, you know, massive social media campaign, narco presidente, narco AMLO, narco Claudia, narco this, narco that. You know, they know they're not going to make Sheinbaum lose, but they want to destabilize the situation and try to have Sheinbaum on the defensive as soon as she gets into office, right? And so now, in the Ecuadorian situation, what's the big hashtag? It's narco embajadas AMLO, AMLO's narco embassies, right? Because now they're trying to play this from the Ecuadorian media that AMLO is housing narcos in the embassies. You see how it's all connected? What happens with this whole media barrage from the corporate media in January, February, and what's happening now in Ecuador. They're using Ecuador to try to hit Mexico, right, and create this idea again of narco embassies. Right? The good thing is AMLO's approval rating has gone up 11 points over this period, so it's a big kind of middle finger to American corporate media and all these lies. But there's a lot of money. There's millions of dollars behind these hashtag campaigns. The hashtag campaign from Narco AMLO continues, right? With bots coming in from Argentina, from Colombia, from Spain. Morena said it's the Atlas network behind it. I wouldn't be surprised one bit, right? Atlas Network just hosted a conference here in Mexico City. They brought somebody over from the Partido Popular, spent a lot of money on it, right? Atlas Network is very focused on Latin America. So it's something we all on the left should be very, aware of. And anything that people can do from the United States is so important. It's so important, whether it's letters to the editor against these awful articles, whether it's social media, whether it's getting out in the street, and Alina said, protesting at the Ecuadorian embassy. Because, and this is my last thought, I won't go on too much longer. It's, Morena is going to win this election. Morena is going to win this election. There's very little doubt. The fight is going to be the post-election, right? Because Mexico's got its National Electoral Institute, and it's got an electoral tribunal. It's not like the US where there are 50 different state battles. There's one electoral tribunal which has the power to qualify or disqualify the election. So if the electoral tribunal says it's disqualified, it's disqualified. That's where the fight's going to be, and that's where we have to be very careful about.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Kurt, and thank you everybody for joining us.